Welcome to the Book Faire Podcast. My name is Anthony, and this show is all about children's literature and the freedom to read. This week, we have an interview with J.S. Puller, author of The Lost Things Club. Next week, we will have another episode covering new book releases as well as another interview on Friday. Make sure to follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to stay up to date on the latest news in children's literature. Now, let's begin with this week's interview. Hello, J.S. Puller. How are you doing today?
Hi, I am great. I am so excited to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on and being generous with your time. Can you start us off just by introducing yourself for the audience and the work that we'll be discussing today?
All right. Well, hello, audience. My name is J.S. Puller. I'm a playwright and author based out of the Windy City, Chicago. I've got several published plays and a couple published novels, and today we're going to be talking about what my mother calls my second born, my pandemic baby, which is my second novel, The Lost Things Club, which came out in 2021 from Little Brown Books for Young Readers.
And how long have you been a playwright?
You know, I think I've been a playwright my entire life and just didn't realize it right away. I definitely wrote my first play in 5th grade, and it was definitely just really bad Star Trek fan fiction disguised as a play. I spent most of my youth absolutely determined to become an actor. I was going to be on Broadway. I was going to make a name for myself and win lots of Tonys. Then in college, I took a playwriting course just because I thought it sounded like a lot of fun, and I realized it was even more fun than acting. And so I sort of switched my loyalties there, junior year of college.
And so going from aspiring actor to playwright, what was it that led you to shifting into traditional publishing?
There was no direct sort of line, but the story that I usually tell when I'm speaking with student groups, I often talk about my first book, Captain Superlative, which I actually wrote as a play. And I was very, very fortunate a couple years, oh my goodness, more than a decade ago at this point. I feel old now. But more than a decade ago, a fabulous theater company in the Chicago suburbs performed my play. It was a teenage cast. And as I sat there in the theater listening to these amazing kids do this amazing work, referring to their acting, not necessarily my writing, I just realized I wasn't done with the story. So during National Novel Writing Month, I decided to challenge myself to turn it into a novel. So it went from play to novel, and then I was fortunate enough. I work at the University of Chicago, and they offer continuing education classes with special tuition for staff members, and they were offering a class on writing novels for young readers, and I took the class and I used it to polish up Captain Superlative. And within, I wanna say 6 months or so, I had a book deal for that first book.
And that first book was also published by Little Brown Books?
It was originally published by Disney Hyperion. They sort of traded me and my books like a baseball player about a year afterwards. So now everything comes out through Little Brown, yes.
And so going from Captain to Superlative and then working on your second, which was your pandemic baby. Can you talk a little bit about what the inspiration was for the Lost Things Club?
Well, everything sort of circles back around to the University of Chicago, it seems. The university was how I took the class to refine Captain Superlative, and the university is what sort of gave me my inspiration for the Lost Things Club. I normally work in a lot of communications roles at the university, but for a couple years, I was fortunate enough to be a research assistant on a report that we conducted. It was through Ingenuity Chicago and the U Chicago Consortium on School Research. And the report was the arts education and social emotional learning outcomes among K through 12 students. It was developing a theory of action to look at how taking classes in arts, in theater, in dance, in music, etc., could basically improve you as a human being. And as part of that study, we conducted focus groups and interviews with arts teachers and teaching artists all around Chicago. And I'm going to read this to you actually so I don't misquote it. We had this amazing story that we heard from one of the teaching artists. A theater teaching artist noted, in reflecting on the way in which her work might affect students socially and emotionally, that one of the hardest things in class is showing up, just showing up. So she designed an activity around showing up, having each student stand up one by one while the other students clapped and recite a line using a performance voice. At the end of the activity, a classroom teacher approached the theater teaching artist, so moved that she herself could barely speak, and said, "That child doesn't talk." The teaching artist noticed that this was normal. Sometimes students did not wish to speak in front of their peers. The classroom teacher replied, "No, you don't understand. It's on his IEP. We try to get him to speak, but he doesn't speak." So we had a student with selective mutism who suddenly decided during a theater activity to speak. Now, I have no idea who this teaching artist was. I didn't conduct this interview myself. I don't know who this student was. I don't know what the student's story was, but I was obsessed. I was absolutely obsessed with that story. And, when writers get obsessed with something, we often try to work out in our brains sort of a way to finish the story, to fill in the blanks there. And so that was one of the biggest sources of inspiration for the Lost Things Club, was wondering about someone who doesn't speak but learns to find their voice through a theater activity.
That's beautiful. And just to make sure that we're covering everything kind of holistically, can we delve into the story of the Lost Things Club so that the listeners can have a little more context?
Right, so the story of the Lost Things Club is told from the point of view of a 12-year-old named Leah who goes to spend the summer in Chicago with her cousin TJ. And she is shocked when she arrives there and realizes that TJ has gone completely mute. Now, he's been this adorable chatterbox who she adores, loves like a brother, but all of a sudden, he's not speaking. And she knows that he has been through a really terrible ordeal. And in the world of the novel, he survived a school shooting. Now, to just broadly put it out there, this is not a book about school shootings. This is a book about an aftermath because Leah is sort of the kind of person who rolls up her sleeves and says, "Okay, I'm going to fix everything." And she discovers that TJ does speak, but he only speaks when he visits a laundromat where he hangs out with another girl from the neighborhood and they make up stories together. And so the book sort of becomes Leah's journey to understand what is happening with TJ, what is so special about these stories that they're telling, and what she can do to help him sort of come to terms with the trauma that he's endured. And in the process, they accidentally become YouTube stars.
And now, in the process of doing this show for a couple of years, I have covered so many books that have handled very sensitive topics for young readers. And notably, one of the ones that hasn't been touched nearly as much as it should be is the topic of school shootings. In the United States, we experience shootings in public schools and private schools at a rate far higher than other countries across the world. And with a book for young readers handling such a sensitive topic, what has been your experience with getting this book published and with the response from readers?
It's been an interesting challenge. I think a lot of people sort of in the industry world, the agents and editors that I work with all recognize that this was an incredibly important topic that needed to be addressed, that students were thinking about, that was a part of their everyday lives, that naturally had a place in the world of literature. But at the same time, we realized it had to be handled in a very, very delicate manner. As I said, this is not a story about a school shooting. There are no flashbacks to the shooting. There is no active violence in the story itself. Everything is 100% aftermath. And it's looking at the fact that there is a life that happens after tragedy. And you have to sort of learn to integrate who you were before and who you are now into who you're going to be in the future. And from a literary standpoint, this all made perfect sense. I would say the bigger challenge sort of came with the world of middle grade literature. You're not marketing to the kids directly. You are marketing to their parents, to their teachers, to their librarians. And I think some of the subject matter made people very, very nervous, very, very squeamish. We are in an age where children's literature is being scrutinized in ways it never has been before. And I think that sometimes makes these gatekeepers very hesitant to give kids the stories they want for fear of something going wrong, of it upsetting the kids, of it upsetting other kids, of upsetting other parents. It is a very tricky place to be, middle grade fiction right now.
Yes, and you mentioned the topic of children's literature being scrutinized very heavily right now, and of course, on the Book Fair podcast, I cover a lot of book bans, and I'm guessing, is that one of the ways that you're talking about children's literature as being looked at closely?
Oh, absolutely. As far as I know, I have not been banned yet, but that's just as far as I know. A ban isn't necessarily a big extravaganza with lights and fireworks and people shouting at each other on Twitter. It can be very much simple as I don't want to subject my child to a story about something violent that could potentially happen to them. It can be a book ban can be as small as a parent just saying, "No, you're not ready for this."
Right, and it can also be very quiet. It can be done quietly, it can be done on the household level, and it can also be done on the selection level. Have you been able to hear any responses from educators and librarians about the Lost Things Club?
Well, I did get I got a very positive starred review from School Library Journal, which I'm gonna have to paraphrase. I don't remember the exact wording. Was it they called it a must read for starting important conversations, which was absolutely lovely and heartwarming thing to hear. But in terms of individual practitioners, it's much harder. With my first book, Captain Superlative, it got named to a bunch of, state lists, the Texas Bluebonnet and the Florida Sunshine State and Illinois Reads, and so it was much, much easier to get it into the hands of librarians and then get them to send me feedback. It has been much more challenging with the Lost Things Club, in part because of the subject matter, and then in part because it came out during the pandemic, and everything was such a mess during the pandemic in terms of sharing literature and marketing books. It was a complete flip-flopped experience. When Captain Superlative came out, I toured bookstores and visited schools in several different states. When the Lost Things Club came out, we were all still in lockdown. I think I walked over to the local library and donated a copy to the librarian, and she asked me to sign it, and that was about the extent of the festivities. Because time and place.
And with the positive review from the school library journal, and also just the fact that maybe a part of it has been with the release window during the pandemic and losing out on marketing. Do you think that this is going to impact any future releases that you may write?
I certainly hope not. There's always that looming threat, when editors are looking at your manuscript, if you have previously published manuscripts, they have access to see, how many copies of any book might be sold. And, the Lost Things Club pales in comparison to Captain Superlative. So that's always in the back of my mind. My agent is shopping around a couple of different manuscripts right now, and my greatest fear is always that the editor's just gonna take a look at the sales numbers for Lost Things Club and go, "Nope, next." Hopefully not, but it is definitely a lingering threat.
And about those potential manuscripts, are there any that you're working on that you'd be willing to disclose right now?
Oh, well, let me think. Right now, my agent I'm keeping her busy. She's drinking from the fire hose when she works with me. Right now, she's shopping around a picture book, 2 middle grade manuscripts, and 2 young adult manuscripts. I'm keeping her busy. This is actually my 3rd agent. The book that she signed me with is a retelling of a couple, stories from Greek mythology, specifically the Pygmalion myth. coupled with the myth of Daedalus and Icarus. But it's told from the point of view of Aphrodite, and she speaks with a very modern voice. She makes references to things like Encanto and We Don't Talk About Bruno, and she's obsessed with Elvis, and she wears Crocs and stuff, and she so it's a very accessible voice, and it examines, in the Pygmalion myth, which, if you're not familiar, Pygmalion carves a statue, the statue is brought to life, the two of them get married, fall in love, and live happily ever after. The story doesn't really give any voice to the statue. Her name is Galatea, and in every interpretation I've ever seen, she doesn't have any dialogue, except for the Disney Hercules animated series. She doesn't have any dialogue. So it's very much examining sort of the role of people who don't necessarily have a voice in Greek mythology and how they feel about the events that are taking place around them. And very, very strong focus on Pygmalion's sister Phoebe, on Galatea, on several of the other sort of side characters who are sort of trapped in this ridiculous myth. So that's the YA manuscript.
So between this manuscript and the Lost Things Club, it seems that giving a voice to the voiceless is a recurring theme in your writing. Is that something that you do intentionally, or is that something that comes about naturally in the writing process?
I think it probably comes about naturally, but just because of my life experiences. I am a young woman, and I have spent much of my life being dismissed because of my gender, because of the way I present myself. Um, I'm not saying I have it as bad as many of my ancestors did, but when you come from a background that's so easily dismissed, you want to have a voice and you want to give your characters voices.
And I think this segues very beautifully into what I typically use as the last question. I want to give you a chance to give your final words. It's very open ended. J.S. Puller, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
When I'm writing a play, I always say that it's very important for me to be entertaining first and foremost and not didactic. And it's a little more complicated in writing novels, but I think the sort of guiding star I have, at least in my recent sort of writing adventures, is I'm probably going to butcher this. It's a quote from Stephen Hopkins, where he says, "I've never heard or seen, heard, or smelled an issue that was so dangerous that it couldn't be talked about." I just thoroughly believe that any topic is fair game as long as it is treated with the respect and dignity, and the audience is treated with that same respect and dignity that's necessary. So my writing is all over the place, but I don't shy away from the scary stuff.
Thank you.
Except for I don't write horror because that scares me.
Thank you. That was an interview with J.S. Puller. Her book, The Lost Things Club, is available now. You can learn more about J.S. and her novels as well as her playwright portfolio at pullerwrites.wordpress.com. If you appreciate the work being done on this show, there are a number of ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, or follow wherever you are currently listening to help push the show out to new listeners. Second, you can follow on Instagram, TikTok, and Blue Sky at Book Faire Pod. Lastly, you can follow the show on Patreon at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free, and there are no posts hidden behind a paywall. Of course, the best way to help the Book Faire podcast grow is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.